students in the EMBA program in Aboriginal Business and Leadership. And this is the first kind of event like this that we've held that's been a public event on an issue of public importance related to the program. And so it's really exciting to see so many people who are interested and coming out to take part with us. And while we're addressing these important issues, we're also celebrating this program, which we think is very exciting. So, welcome to all of you. I'd like to recognize that we are meeting on Coast Salish territory, and we're very fortunate because we have both Coast Salish people here, and in particular we have Chief Ian Campbell, a hereditary chief from the Squamish Nation, who will welcome us on behalf of the Coast Salish peoples.
Thank you, Mark, and good evening. Kokoil, Tanoya, Tansaquetels, Awanox, Tansawan, Kipachnomiwit, the Awanoxwit, which I have Platnomot, the Siemens, the Squamish, the Komathwim, the Tsleil of the Awanox, Tansawan, at least Kokoyinsuitswit. Just want to say good evening, and it's wonderful to be here, and thank you, Mark, for allowing us the opportunity to provide welcoming remarks on behalf of our local tribes, the Squamish, Musqueam, Tsleil. It's a wonderful event to welcome Dr. Stephen Cornell and our distinguished guests that are with us. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us, and to each of you, I want to commend you all for the work you're doing. Thumbs up to our cohort, so proud of our inaugural EMBA, Aboriginal Business and Leadership, and to all of our friends and relatives that are here with us tonight. We're in a part of our Coast Salish territory known as Kamkamalai. It references the beautiful maple trees in the forest that once stood here. Our Douglas firs and cedars stood as tall as some of these buildings down here, 300 feet tall, was the canopy. So this land has sustained our peoples for innumerable generations, and we certainly celebrated what we call our professionals, the wealth that was generated from these lands, and continues to contribute to the global context. So it's an exciting place to continue to gather, as our ancestors have done for many thousands of years. And I have to warn Dr. Cornell that we do take captives. So tomorrow when you come to our class, we might not let you go. We're very intrigued by your writings and the comparisons of Indigenous peoples, the impacts of colonization that continue to pose both a challenge and an opportunity for us in this generation to continue striving forward. So that's built on the efforts of many of the people that are here, recognizing a lot of the leadership, that they're certainly part of the game changers in this part of the world. And we look forward to the discussions tonight. So please be comfortable while you're in our territory, and welcome to each of you. Waututh.
Thanks so much, Ian. While Ian is almost ending, I think this would be a good time to recognize the most important people who are here, and they are the students in the EMBA program. So could all the students in the EMBA program please stand up? We celebrate your success so far and your willingness to take risks by entering a new program like this with us. There are some other people, there are many other people in the audience who I should be recognizing, but at the risk of offending people, I'm only going to recognize two. I'd like to recognize that Joyce Murray is with us, Member of Parliament. Joyce? Thank you. And Andrew Petter, Professor of Public Policy and President of Simon Fraser University. There's one other person who needs to be recognized. Ulrika Rademacher is where exactly? Without Ulrika, none of us would be here because nothing would be organized. There would be no lights, no seats. But Ulrika does much more than organize that. She's held things together over the last many months and used her experience and imagination to make things work with the program and all the activities around it. So thank you. I'd now like to introduce Professor Stephen Cornell. I'm not going to give a full introduction to Steve or any of the panelists who I'll be introducing later because we have lots of people and not that much time. But Steve Cornell is a professor of sociology and public administration and policy at the University of Arizona, and he's been there since 1998. Before that, he was at Harvard, where he co-founded the Harvard Project on Indian Economic Development, and he continues to be the co-director of that project and a few other things as well. I'm not going to start listing his publications because there are too many of them, but as all of you know, he's probably the most important researcher there is in the field of Indigenous economic development. And I can speak from personal experience that no academic has had anything. He's had more influence on the way in which economic development is practiced in BC than all other academics combined. So it's a great pleasure that Stephen was able to come here to teach this course, and the next half hour or so is going to be his introduction to the course, as well as being a lecture for all of us. So thank you very much for coming, Stephen.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's a lot to live up to there. I want to thank Chief Campbell for that welcome. It's a pleasure to be in Coast Salish territory and share this space with the First Peoples of this continent. I appreciate that very much. And I want to thank Mark Selman and Simon Fraser for having me up here. And for what they're doing with this program, which strikes me as important and innovative and necessary, and some students have submitted their assignments already, so something's working. That seldom happens. The class doesn't meet until tomorrow. So something's working well. I also want to thank all of you for being here on a rainy Wednesday night. Maybe that's not unusual. This is Vancouver, but in Tucson, Arizona, where I live, on a night like this, we go home. And we have one or two nights like this a year. Mark asked me if I would talk a bit about the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development and the work that's come out of it. There are a number of people in the room I recognize, and I have a feeling I may be taking some of you over very well-known ground. It's kind of interesting sometimes to be asked to speak, and I arrive at a place and people say, yeah, we've read a bunch of your work, and I think, well, then why am I being asked to speak? You already know everything I've got to say. So I hope I can say some things tonight that will be useful to you. I thought what I would do is say a little bit about the origins of the Harvard Project, because I think it remains even today kind of an interesting and valuable story. And then say a little bit about some of the challenges that I think face First Nations in your country and mine and elsewhere who are trying to reclaim governance as an Indigenous right, tradition, practice, who are trying to build economies that can support their people and enable people to live productive lives in their homelands. We're trying to build productive relationships with other governments, are trying at a fundamental level, I think, to be themselves. So I'm going to take you back to the late 1980s when I was sitting in my office in the sociology department at Harvard University, and I got a call from an economist named Joe Kalt who said, I've got some data here that I'm puzzled by. He'd been looking at data on timber and cattle and a few other economic sectors involving Indigenous nations in the United States. And he'd come across two nations related to each other, essentially the same culture and language, with adjacent lands, And one nation was performing very well economically. They were running a number of nation-owned enterprises that were functioning in the black. The other nation, with a similar resource base, a similar landscape, generally a similar situation, was treading water or spinning its wheels and unable to get any sustained economic activity off the ground. And this was a puzzle because if you sort of think your top-of-the-head explanations of what accounts for economic success, well, resources, education, access to markets, you can come up with all these factors. But here were two nations which shared most of that, but were performing very differently. And he said he'd asked one of his graduate students if there was anyone on the faculty who studied contemporary Indigenous stuff, and the person came up with my name, so he said, "You want to have some lunch?" And I said, "Sure." I even thought I might know something of the answer because I happen to know something of the history of these two nations, and I knew that one of them was one of the worst cases of colonial imposition of coercive controls in the history of the United States. Their land had been turned in fundamentally into a concentration camp in which other nations were placed. The indigenous leadership had been suppressed, and that was the nation that was flailing around. The nation that was successful had had some of that experience, but it had had a different person in charge in the 1880s and 90s who, instead of suppressing indigenous leadership, had worked with it. Instead of trying to break down traditional social organization, had decided to simply work with it. And I wondered, and he wondered when we eventually had lunch, whether that difference accounted to some degree for the differential performance of these two communities. That was the origin of the Harvard Project, because essentially what we wanted to know was, why are some nations more successful than others? Now, in those days, success to us was thought of in essentially economic terms, and that was driven in part by data issues. We could get data on employment, on child poverty, on household poverty, on those kinds of things. So that's what we were looking at. And we went to the Ford Foundation and said, you know, we think there are other cases like this as we look across Indian country, as it's called in the United States. Cases where some nations are doing better than others and the explanation isn't obvious. And we also think that if we could figure out what the explanation is, that might in fact be useful. And I think to the Ford Foundation's credit, they said, okay, we'll take a bet on that. And they gave us our first grant, and that was the beginning of the Harvard Project. And from there, it turned into a fairly massive activity as we headed out into the field and spent a lot of time with indigenous nations across the United States, looking at places where things seemed to go well and places where they didn't go well, and trying to understand what the explanation was. And I can summarize the core of the explanation, let me put it that way. I can summarize fairly briefly, and it'll be familiar to some of you, but as we looked across these nations, we found that the, quote, successful, unquote, ones were characterized typically by at least three things. They had displaced the U.S. government as the primary decision maker on their lands. And we call that the self-determination finding. We couldn't find a nation in the United States putting on a sustained economic performance in which the primary decision maker was someone other than the nation itself. And by primary decision maker, I mean everything from how many board feet of timber are we going to cut in the tribal forest this year to what kind of government do you have and how do you organize that government. To what kind of relationship do you have with that city nearby or with the state of South Dakota? Or what kind of relationship do you have with the U.S. government? So that was the self-determination finding. The second thing we found, that assertion of governing power, that self-determination had to be backed up. It had to be backed up by capable governing institutions, and we called this the governance finding. In other words, rights were not enough. You had to exercise those rights productively and effectively. And if you didn't, the rights, in essence, were wasted. The opportunities were squandered. And then it turned out, and this turned out to be the finding that I think interested a lot of people, There was nothing really particularly striking about what we've come up with so far. Not just any governing institutions will do. It turned out that imposed institutions fared especially badly. And that what you had to do was find what we called something we called cultural match, but which fundamentally had to do with legitimacy. It had to do with whether or not the formal institutions of governance, how you actually organized, fit or resonated with Indigenous conceptions of how authority ought to be organized and exercised. And the reason imposed solutions didn't work is because they came out of someone else's value system, someone else's notion of what would be efficient or effective, someone else's notion of how you should do things, rather than out of an Indigenous conception of how you should do things. We call that cultural match. I think of it as the legitimacy finding. It's simply the idea that people respect governments that reflect their own sense of what's appropriate and just. And where you have imposed governments that don't reflect that, people don't respect them, and you don't get good performance. And what that meant was that there were no single solutions across Indigenous nations. And my favorite example of that is two of the nations in our first field sample in 1986, 87, 88, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes of the Flathead Reservation in Montana and Cochiti Pueblo in New Mexico. The Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes are three nations forced together by the U.S. government in a treaty in 1855, two of them traditional enemies, and told you must live together on this land. Their traditions were different. When they asserted self-governing power, they had to find a way to compromise. And what they chose was nobody's first choice, but everyone's second choice. Good old U.S. governing institutions. Look like they came out of a high school civics textbook in Ames, Iowa. And that's the government they chose, because the Salish didn't want a Kootenai government, the Kootenai didn't want a Salish government, but everybody could say, okay, let's have a U.S. government. And the legitimacy came not from any tradition. It came from the process of Indigenous choice. They chose it. Therefore, it had legitimacy. And they were a success. And you could look at that and say, well, you see, U.S. governing institutions work. That's what my country tells people all over the world. But then you go to Cochiti Pueblo, and you find no written constitution, no elections, no written legal code, a governing system with roots going back as far as anyone knows, multiple thousands of years, modified by Spanish colonialism, modified by Mexican colonialism, modified by U.S. colonialism, but still fundamentally Cochiti, where the chief religious leader calls the men only, I'm afraid, into the plaza of the village on December 29th and appoints the individuals who will run the place for the next 12 months. And then disappears back into the kiva and has no role in politics. And those 6 individuals look at each other and go, oh my God, the future's on our shoulders. And now we have to govern. And it works. It was one of our success stories. And so what we realized was all these nations face similar governance challenges, but they are going to come up with radically different solutions when you allow them to find the solutions that work for them. And that one sort of single answer is not going to be effective. So the point coming out of that research, in a way, was not to get the institutions right, as economists would have it. It was not to get the culture right, as federal bureaucrats frustrated by these cultures so different from their own would like. It was to somehow get the fit between the two right. So in short, Indigenous nations did better at addressing economic issues when they had substantive decision-making power in their own hands, backed up by capable governing institutions that had legitimacy with their people. And that's the core of it. And now, years later, having worked with literally dozens of Indigenous nations and organizations in the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, I think those fundamental research results have held up pretty well. It's not the whole story. If you do all of that, you don't necessarily get success. There's a lot of other things that matter. We all know that. But if you do those things, your chances of success increase dramatically. At least that's what the data says. One other thing I'll add. At the start of that project, our focus was on economy, but it changed over time because one of the things we quickly realized, a lot of the nations we worked with, yes, they were interested in business success and economic prosperity, but there was a lot they would not sacrifice to achieve those things. So there were cultural, political, social criteria where they would say, no, the trade-offs are too much. We will not give up this extent of political power for more money. We will not give up a way of life for more jobs. We'll wait until we see a way to have it all. And we began to realize that what we really were looking at wasn't economy, it was efficacy. It was what is it that enables some nations to be successful at achieving their goals, whatever those goals may be. Whether it's economic development or improved health care or language revitalization or taking better care of our children, whatever that might be. And these same findings seem to be critical. So what do you do with such findings? 2 quick points. First, we quickly found out what some people do with them, which is they quickly use them to support their interests. There were some people in the Canadian government who seized on our findings and said, look, researchers at Harvard University have found out it's your dysfunctional government that's wrong. You need to clean up your Governance Act, First Nations. And conveniently left out the self-determination finding, which was, yeah, but if you clean up your Governance Act and you still don't have any control over anything, what's the point? And on the other side, we had some nations, indigenous nations, who said, you see, federal government, Harvard researchers showed self-determination's what matters. We want our rights. And then failed to back that up by saying, and now we've got to figure out how you exercise those rights effectively. And how you change the habits of dependency built up over generations of powerlessness. And finally, we found some people interpreting that cultural match finding as saying, go back to your traditions, which may be exactly the solution for some people. But what it really was about was find what your people believe is right for you, and then balance that against the need to have a governing system that works. And it's in that interaction. It's got to be effective, and your people have to believe in it. It's in that interaction that you find the success of Indigenous government. The other thing we learned was that a lot of Indigenous nations were interested in what we had learned, but what they really wanted to know was, okay, how do you make it happen? It's great you guys have gone out and found all this stuff and tell us this, but we're the ones who actually have to live it and do it. So that has changed what we've done over the years. And now we actually spend a lot of time working on things like constitutional reform, institutional design, trying to come up and understand how nations can move from dependency and powerlessness into situations of effective governing power that serves their own goals and not someone else's. We're still researchers. We're certainly engaged in that. We have a project going on right now on tribal health care in the United States, where some nations are taking over management of health care. We're trying to figure out, does it deliver better health care when they're in the driver's seat? Our findings, our self-determination findings, suggest the answer is yes. Now we want to find out if that in fact is the case. It also has moved us toward doing more of what you're doing here in the EMBA program that Mark and others of you are involved in, which is trying to find out what are the educational opportunities that can support that emerging group of working First Nation professionals who are trying to figure out how do you govern well. That is an Indigenous tradition, but there's a hiatus there, the colonial period, in which you weren't allowed to. Someone else made all the decisions. And now, if that changes, how do you take advantage of that? And I think it's incumbent on universities like mine to begin to provide a space and a set of ideas and a set of ears to listen, to figure out how you do that, and then make what we learn available to Indigenous people who are in that position and are looking for professional development opportunities. That's an overview of the Harvard project. I'm going to shift gears here a little bit. I want to to bring this discussion back to business and say something about what I think some of the challenges are ahead. Business is booming in Indian country. Not everywhere, certainly. We're all acutely aware of how low the baseline, the starting point of Indigenous poverty and all the associated issues with that are, how low that baseline is. But there's some amazing stuff happening across this continent. We're seeing a burst of Indigenous business. It ranges from things like bison raising at several American Indian nations in the United States to resort management and development at places like Waututh, Dakota, and Saskatchewan at the Tsleil Nation, Sophie's home here in BC, from the Oneida Nation's restoration of their own agricultural traditions today, to First Fisherman Seafoods at Membertou, from the Alaska Native Arts and Crafts people in fly-in-only villages who are using the internet to market their arts and crafts in Germany and France and other places around the world, to the White Mountain Apache tribe in Arizona who manage their massive forest for sustained timber yield, water conservation, and trophy quality health, multi-purpose forest management, and they've done a better job of it than the U.S. Forest Service or even other private forest managers. So there's a great deal happening out there. The diversity is enormous. It reflects not only the circumstances and opportunities of the various nations involved, it reflects different values, different cultures, different conceptions of what kind of a future they want. And of course, it's not happening everywhere, which leads me to 4 challenges that seem to me to require our attention. The first is size and isolation. You all know more about this because it's more of a problem in Canada. We face this problem in the US, in Alaska, and even in parts of Southern California where we have some tiny nations that are struggling, nations with adult populations in the 50 and under range. I think these are the toughest development challenges out there. Are in small and or isolated nations, and I'd be kidding you if I said I thought I had silver bullets for such situations. I don't, but some nations have cracked the code. And just to give you a couple of illustrations, these aren't full-bore solutions, but they're steps in the right direction. I mentioned the Arts and Crafts Cooperative in the interior of Alaska and across the northern part of Alaska that markets craft and artwork internationally on the internet as a way to keep artists involved in their art and to support families. In the interior of Alaska, in the Yukon Flats, the U.S. government and the state of Alaska have to try to track what's happening with climate change, what's happening to the animal populations, moose and caribou and others in that region. They have very limited resources with which to track that stuff. The Council of Athabascan Tribal Governments finally went to the U.S. government and said, we know this country better than any of your people do. Why don't you give us the contracts to count the caribou and the moose, to tell you what's happening on our track lines, to track the changes in the temperature and in the nature of the soil and so forth. Train us to do what you need, and we'll train you to understand what we know about this land and about those populations. And they got some of those contracts. That's employment doing what they know and what they do best. There's institution sharing going on, where small nations are joining forces because they recognize that scale matters when you're dealing with government, when you're dealing maybe with joint venture partners. So you have Clicho building a Clicho government in the Northwest Territories of 4 First Nations, distant from each other, but all the same people. You have what Sophie, Pierre, and her colleagues, Catherine Denise and others, have been doing at the Tsleil Nation, saying we reject Canada's division of us into multiple First Nations. We're going to reclaim an identity that we know is ours, and we're going to organize on the basis of that identity. And one of the benefits of that is overcoming some of the problems of scale. Meadow Lake Tribal Council in Saskatchewan, 9 First Nations, some Dene, some Cree, not even sharing the same culture, but running a bunch of economic enterprises because they realized that together they can overcome some of these problems of scale and begin to do creative economic kinds of things. Those are very tough problems, but I think we're beginning to see something we've seen in other areas as well, which is Indigenous nations, once set free, given support, can begin to solve some of these things. Second challenge, I was recently, Mark and I were talking about this, recently in New Zealand, where for the last few years I've been doing some work with some Maori organizations there. And at a conference there, a number of the Maori tribes called iwi have received significant settlements from the New Zealand government. And by significant, I mean in the multiple millions of dollars from the New Zealand government in recent years in the settlement of various claims. Fisheries claims, land claims, foreshore claims, and so forth. And a number of those iwi are moving vigorously into economic development. And I heard a senior iwi leader there at a conference on economic development. One of the men actually who was an architect of these settlements, who was one of the drivers that forced the New Zealand government to the table. And he said, I was part of this, but I'm worried about the outcome. He said, what I want to know is where is the Maori in Maori economic development? He said, I'm worried that as we go down this road, we'll end up being simply Pakea, that's the Maori term for white people, with a suntan. And is that what we want? And I think, another way to put that is how do you keep Aboriginal business development from becoming an assimilation program? I think it's a legitimate fear. It concerns me. But I also think some have cracked the code. The Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians in the state of Mississippi, one of the great economic success stories in the United States, they put significant quantities of the money that they made into things like language revitalization, cultural practice, sustaining the community. When Chief Philip Martin, who's since passed on from that nation, was asked, how do you know business is good for your people? His response was, well, it used to be everybody was leaving. Now they're coming home. That's his metric, in a sense. The Red Lake Band of Chippewa uses its fish processing plant, which markets walleye fillets to restaurants and grocery stores across the Midwestern United States. They encourage their families to get back into fishing, which is their old tradition. Hook and line. You catch 20 walleye and bring them to us, we'll weigh you and pay you by the pound market rates. Now they have growing numbers of citizens involved in fishing once again after a long hiatus, involved in fishing and restoring that as a family activity, which is what it always was. This is business as the key to a cultural revitalization effort. The Citizen Band of Potawatomi uses its business success to escape its dependence on the U.S. government and to assure that it will never again be subject to outsiders' decisions about its future. Rocky Barrett, the chairman of that tribe, he said to me, business development for us is self-defense. That's what it is. Never again will we have to do what they say because they control the purse strings. But there is a real issue here, and I think we need to put creative effort into thinking about how you might use business to strengthen culture, rebuild social relations, restore a sense of nationhood, and empower nations. And one thing that involves is strategic clarity. Why are you in business? What is it you're trying to do with it? Is it just to get rich? Or is it this instrument that the nation has developed in order to achieve other things? And if so, what does that mean for how you do business? Third challenge, government. In my experience in the four countries that I know best, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, perhaps least in the US, but there too, there's considerable flailing around looking for a solution to the Indigenous problem. The sort of problem of Indigenous people who tend to be poor, angry, and a lot of the time in the way. And so government tries to impose solutions. The Indian Act, the Indian Reorganization Act in the United States, the Office of the Registrar of Indigenous Corporations in Australia, which tells you how you better organize if you want to organize something. It imposes that on you. Get them all educated and into the cities. Turn First Nations into municipalities. You go on and on. There's a solution. And you get this hyperactive policy environment that looks for boilerplate solutions to Indigenous issues. But I think the solutions to a significant degree are to be found in Indigenous nations themselves. And it's not that they don't need support and resources, I think they do. But as my colleague Joe Cald once said, the best thing government can do is to get out of the way and let Indigenous nations pursue their agendas instead of Ottawa's or Washington's or Canberra's or Wellington's. Because as long as central governments insist on determining the future of those nations, I think that future, if the historical record is any indication, is pretty grim. So time for a change. But there's another point, and it's not only for government, but it's for us in the academy too. I actually think one of the contributions that the Harvard Project made, we didn't realize it at the time, it was a very simple contribution, was simply to change the conversation about Indian nations and Indigenous peoples. Instead of asking what's wrong out there, we ask what's working out there. And that may be a simple point, but if I go back to where we started, what Joe Cald and I really wanted to know wasn't why one nation was in trouble, but why the other was succeeding. That was the surprise, was the one of those two nations that was doing so well. Wait a minute, something's happening out there. What is that? But both government policy and a lot of academic research starts with a problem. What's wrong out there and how do we fix it? Let's go study what's wrong. And if you start there, it doesn't take long to discover that what's wrong has to do with what outsiders do. The historical disaster of colonialism, residential schools, a succession of failed policies. All correct, but now you're focused on what others are doing and need to do, and you lose sight of Indigenous nations as anything but victims. But if you start by asking what's working out there, and you zero in on who's doing interesting, innovative, effective things, then you focus on native nations themselves. And then you notice the creativity and the innovation and the solutions that Indigenous nations themselves are producing. And that's a different conversation. And I think it's actually the more important conversation. I was talking recently with an Australian anthropologist we've worked with, and she was talking about the refusal of the Australian government to take Indigenous people seriously as political actors. And she said, you know, it's time we gave up on the Australian government. Why do we spend so much time worrying about what they do? We know what they do. They ignore Indigenous peoples. They come up with policy initiative after policy initiative that doesn't work. Let's forget about them. Let's look at what Indigenous nations are doing. And when you start doing that, even in Australia, which is a tough environment for Indigenous people, you discover creativity, innovation, resourcefulness, and things that work. And that's what we should be paying attention to. So last point, and then I'll shut up here. What if central governments really truly supported Indigenous self-determination? That raises the last challenge, and this one falls squarely in the lap of Indigenous nations themselves. If, in fact, they take self-determination seriously, then you have to govern well. On Monday, I was on the phone with a colleague who was dealing with a First Nation in the United States that was going through a political crisis. The council, their legislature, was immobilized by family-based factional conflicts. The dominant faction had recently voted to boot out the elected tribal chairman. The constitution that the nation was using was unclear on whether they even had the right to do that, but they were threatening to barricade the building in order to assert that right. It was a mess. Now, who's going to invest in that situation? And I don't necessarily mean dollars. What tribal citizen is going to say, I'm going to bet a piece of my life, my ideas, my energy on the future of this nation because I believe in it, when what they deal with is this chaotic political situation in which you don't know what the rules are, you don't know who's in charge, you don't know if next week you'll have a job. Forgive me, I got to raise my kids, I'm headed for LA, or Minneapolis, or Kamloops, somewhere where I can escape this. That's the governance challenge. Years ago, a wise and long-serving leader of an American Indian nation said to me, the best defense of sovereignty, he meant of self-determination, the best defense of sovereignty is to exercise it effectively. It's not to march in the streets, it's not to litigate, though you better be ready to do both. It's to govern well. It's to have that track record that they can't attack. So it's one thing to have rights, it's another thing to make effective use of them. And the nations that we see who are succeeding in business and in other endeavors are nations that take that governance challenge seriously and act on it. And I think this is really the bottom line. If you win the battle for self-determination, and that's a big if, especially these days. In my country, the Supreme Court is going consistently now against Indigenous self-determination, sovereignty, and interests. I know much less about the political situation here, but none of my First Nation friends tells me it's good. Around the world, there's been progress on Indigenous rights that is now under attack. But if you win that battle for self-determination, then the next challenge is actually the tougher one, because now you have to deliver. You've got to govern well. You've got to make good law. You've got to deal fairly with conflict. You have to form strong partnerships with other governments. You have to provide your people with a stable environment where they not only want to live, but can live and raise their kids. So I think governing well is not just the key to Indigenous business development, it's actually the key to flourishing people and flourishing families and flourishing nations. And that's why we pay so much attention to it. So thanks very much.
So now I'm going to ask each of our three respondents to raise an issue and or ask a question. And I thought we might start with Sophie Pierre first, because she's known Steve Cornell for a long time, and she might just sort of introduce this process a bit more gently, and give Steve half a chance to find his feet before we really throw the tough questions at him. So everybody knows that Sophie Pierre is the Chief Commissioner of the BC Treaty Commission, has been for the last 4 or 5 years, probably seems like 15 or 20, I suspect. Sophie is better equipped to address these issues than just about anyone I can think of. She's been the administrator to the Tanaha Tribal Council. For many years she's been a chief. She's been chair of the Tribal Council, and she's led a major economic development venture which involved turning a residential school into a resort, which is now one of my favorite places to teach. So I will hand the floor over to Sophie Pierre.
Thank you very much, Mark. Good evening, everyone. It's really good to be here, and I want to thank the Beedie School of Business for inviting me to be part of this panel this evening. And I just want to, well, first of all, Chief EM, thank you for the welcome. It's always good to be in your and the other nations here, traditional territory, and I always have to remember that because I spend a lot of time here in the Lower Mainland. I spend a lot of time, I am Tunaha from the southeast corner of British Columbia. But many years ago, I got this title of being a coast Kootenai, so I think I just kind of stuck with it. Stephen, it's always a pleasure to listen to you, and I've been working with you for a number of years now. But regardless of that, I always just really enjoy the presentations that you do, and there's always something that that I bring away from each of the interactions that we have. I've worked with Stephen and Mammy DeGay and Joe Calt and others with the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona, so looking forward to another meeting again in just a month. So that's been a really good experience and a good learning for me, and a good place to kind of recharge my batteries, because you get together with other people that are very much looking at ways to just improve lives of their nations and how we can work together and to see the changes that are really necessary. What I want to kind of zero in on in the talk that you just gave us, Stephen, is around the comment you made about no single solution. And I want to come at it from a couple of different ways. First of all, in terms of the whole treaty process, as Mark mentioned, I am the Chief Commissioner for the BC Treaty Commission. And this was a process that was set up by First Nations here in British Columbia for a very particular purpose. And we set it up 21 years ago. Figured that in that time, when we set it up back in 1992, we figured that by the year 2000, we were going to be able to deal with this outstanding question about governance, about land, and all the jurisdictions and everything that were issues then, and they're still issues today. But at that point, it was our choice as First Nations that we came together and set this up. So this idea about that there's no single solution, I think that we've known that and we've embraced that. We know that that's the situation here, particularly in British Columbia. We have 200 Indian bands that are now called First Nations, and that's part of the problem. We have, again, to go back to that no single solution, back to the choice. Stephen mentioned that there are some nations, like the Ktunaxa Nation. We chose that we would enter into this treaty process as a nation, so that representative of all the people within our nation, so that we go, everything that we do is in terms of nationhood, as opposed to band membership. There's no discussion there around band membership. There's no discussion there around status Indians as opposed to non-status. We have Ktunaxa citizens that are making the decision about this treaty. So there's that solution for some First Nations have gone forward in terms of pursuing the treaty process. Got all kinds of problems with it. Lord, don't even get me started. But it is one of the solutions. And we have former Chief Campbell here, and of course we all know that Waututh was the first treaty that was signed within this particular process. Then we've got the Waututh, we've got Yale that was just finally went through the House of Commons last summer. And we have other First Nations, other treaty tables that are moving forward that have seen that as their solution. And then we have other First Nations that say, nah, we don't like the treaty solution because we're not satisfied with, usually it's about the mandate of the governments, and they've got a very legitimate point, the mandates suck with the governments. But there are First Nations that feel that they can work with it. They can make it work for them. Like Stephen was talking about, how you find what works for your folks. So there are other First Nations that say, this process is not for us. They go after instead maybe legislated through the federal government, legislated self-government on their Indian reserve lands. That works for them. That is their choice. I would expect that eventually, when you've got a working government on your Indian reserve lands, you're going to start being hemmed in after a while, and you're going to be wanting to be looking at your traditional territory. You're going to be wanting to look at governance, jurisdiction in your traditional territory, as opposed to just that. Those little corrals is what my mother used to call them, the Indian reserve lands that we stay on. And then we still have First Nations right now that want nothing more than the Indian Act. And that's their choice. So again, for them, maybe that's a solution now. I don't think that it's really a long-term solution, but I think that as those First Nations that are right now wanting to stay with the Indian Act, as they develop their own governance structure, they develop their, and you start looking at more jurisdictions, thinking about the stuff that happened today, like, it was pretty amazing. The whole takeover of Health Canada. Like, I was just blown away when I was reading. I mean, I've kept in touch with it. My nation's a part of this. So I know what's going on out there. But I had never really thought that Health Canada actually turned the keys over today to the First Nations Health Authority. And I mean, I had to read that in the sun for it to really sink in with me. And I thought, wow, okay, when you get to that kind of that kind of jurisdictional authority that we're having, just like in the area of health, there's no going back. So while the choice may be for some First Nations to stay with the Indian Act, I think that eventually there's going to have to be movement. And it can be, and it should be, a progressive step, so that you're not just jumping from one right into something that than what that First Nation can actually handle. So I'm all for this idea that there is no single solution. I am very much, of course, suggesting that the ultimate form of reconciliation, of course, but the ultimate form of exercising the rightful jurisdictions that we have within our traditional territories is through a treaty. I recognize that there's also other answers for First Nations right now, that there is no single solution. So, my question then to great friend from the South, and I just got to make a dig, Stephen. You were talking about, who's in charge, like the government, not making a whole bunch of good decisions. And I'm thinking, is he talking Indian government or the American government? I just had to make that name. But anyway, so back to that no single solution. My question then is the idea of no single solution, I think, is one that First Nations understand. I don't think it's one that Canadians in general, Canadian governments for sure, federal and provincial, really understand. Because we still hear the argument. The argument is always around that word equality, right? How can we have equality? Everybody's the same, everybody's got to be treated the same. So my question is around that. When we know that things work for people, when there is not one single solution, usually imposed by somebody else, that solution is nation-driven, how can we then change the mindset, the vocabulary, so that we don't have to always be sort of defending the right for Aboriginal people, our Indigenous right to self-governance, like we're always have to be defending that against what we're being told is not equality, that there has to be this one size fits all for everyone. So how do we bring about that new understanding and come at it with that? Because I don't think a week goes by where we don't see something in the paper. The latest one I'm thinking about is the one over in Nanaimo. Hasn't there been two of those articles in Nanaimo? Demanding that quit complaining Indians, just be the same as everybody else. And then everybody will be happy. We're all the same. So my question is around that. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you, Sophie. I should tell you that Chief Pierre is on the International Advisory Council of our Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona, and she co-chairs that council, and she's been a wonderful leader of our work. And I just want to acknowledge that and thank you for that, Sophie. I think this is a great question, and I don't have an easy answer. I think the only thing we've seen that has worked in the United States, and I realize it's a different context there, where Indigenous issues are, I sometimes wonder if anyone's paying attention. I read the New York Times on a daily basis, and I can read the New York Times for 2 or 3 months and not see a single article about Indians. And I come here and I read the Globe and Mail, and every other day there's something about Aboriginal this, Aboriginal that. Sometimes you think some things happen in Indian country in the US because no one's paying attention. And in Washington, some bureaucrat says, what are they doing? How long have they been doing that? 10 years? Oh my God, I had no idea. But now it's established and it happens. And you know, sometimes it's actually a good thing when no one's paying attention. You can get away with a lot. But to the point, I mean, the thing that I think has helped us in the U.S. is that we've had concrete evidence on the single solution deal. If you, in fact, and let's assume, and I do, I think government is sincerely interested in addressing the terrible conditions on indigenous lands. Now, sure, that competes with all kinds of other interests, so it doesn't get the attention it perhaps needs, but I don't think anybody out there is saying, no, I want to preserve poverty in Indian country. If you're seriously interested in that, and you're confronted with evidence that says diverse solutions works, diversity in solution is not a problem, it in fact is a solution itself, then you suddenly start to think, oh, so Cochiti is successful, Mississippi Choctaw is successful, the Flatheads are successful, Ho-Chunk is successful, etc., and wow, they don't look the same. Maybe there's a lesson in that, even for me as a public policy person, who's always looking for that single solution to a set of problems, because it's more efficient in my way of thinking to have a single solution. Well, if what your goal is to improve indigenous welfare, that is the wrong way to think about it. There won't be a single solution. Every single solution has failed. And everybody's been saying that for years, but we're now in a position to say multiple solutions works and show you evidence. That's what's new. And I think it's incumbent on people like me and others and here in Canada to say that and show the evidence and put it in front of people who make decisions so that we begin to change that mindset, because I completely agree with you. It's a serious problem.
Thanks very much. I'll now call upon Doug McArthur. Doug McArthur is part of the public policy program here at Simon Fraser University. He has lived some of these challenges by being involved either on the staff side or the elected side of governments in 3 provinces, including BC. He's been Deputy Minister of Aboriginal Affairs here in BC and has worked very closely with Tsleil First Nation on treaty and treaty implementation and policy since treaty. So, Doug, over to you.
Thank you very much. I wanted to thank you for the invitation to be a part of this panel. I want to acknowledge and recognize our presence here today on Coast Heritage Land, and thank you, Chief, for your welcome. And I also want to thank for the presentation we received, Stephen. Excellent and very thought-provoking and useful. And I also want to say a word of welcome to the other members of the panel. I thought that the presentation and other things that Stephen has written about are very informative and very useful, as we all recognize. The message, kind of core messages that I'll try to extract, even though there was quite a bit in your far-reaching presentation, and I know what you've said, but the 2 things that I'll draw out of this is that governance matters, and you talked about more detailed aspects of that, and that economic and business development matter. And that I think it's obvious to all of us that, in general, both of those are clearly true. I'd like to just pose a question to you and ask you to expand a little bit more detail about some of your ideas on the relationship, let's put it that way, between governance and an approach to exercise of jurisdiction by First Nations. And you speak about self-determination, and I generally interpret that to mean that you support a fairly broad-based exercise of jurisdiction, a fairly comprehensive exercise of jurisdiction, that there are many ways, notwithstanding the various limitations, many ways to move towards a greater degree of self-determination, and through that exercising jurisdiction, and that means exercising lawmaking power, and all of that is part of self-determination. Business development is, and we've got business students here, so I wanted to kind of just try to relate these two. Business development is widely recognized, effective business development and economic development, does depend upon, in important ways, and you've spoken upon this, upon governance. There are many people who seem to see a contradiction between a close integration of governance, exercise of jurisdiction, lawmaking power, policy-making power by First Nation governments, and their business development capacity and their business development initiatives. To me, there's often a contradiction that people have trouble working out. It seems to me, and you spoke of this, that an important part of governance is establishing effective, workable, rules-based systems to create certainty, predictability, to create a sense of confidence, both in terms of internal, external, about roles, functions, ways of engagement, rules, and ways of engaging, and so on. And yet, you will find that some people argue, when it comes to business development, the First Nation government really doesn't have much business in business. The First Nation government, its capacity is not geared toward business. So let that be done by some other part, some other organization. And I worry about this because, first of all, if effective business it does require effective rules and all those things we've talked about, that's something that has to be done by government and by the First Nation government. Business needs to be, in some sense, business development capacity, in my view, needs to be in some sense clearly subsidiary to that, so that the rules, strategic direction, even overall policy, the benefits and the use of the benefits need to be part of what government does. Can you speak to how to successfully, or whatever your views are on how to successfully integrate to achieve both effective business development and nevertheless respect the important role of governance more generally and its relationship to business development?
Well, I can try, and I think Doug has articulated very nicely the sort of nature of this contradiction, because I do see government, and it's not just contemporary government. I see traditional Indigenous governments as, in essence, instruments that a nation uses to achieve its goals. Traditionally, the Lakota people on the plains of North America had a system of governing which was a very clear distribution of authority that said certain people were responsible for certain things, and you did certain things this way and not that way. There was a set of rules. It's a constitution. It may not have been written down, but it's a constitution that says here's how, as a people, we go about living our lives safely and productively in the environment that we have. And I think that's the task of Indigenous governments today, is to put in place such rules. When it comes to business, there's enormous potential danger. Because how do you prevent the rule maker, which in some cases is going to be a legislature or something like that, from making rules that serve its interests instead of the nation's interests? To bring it down to sort of everyday terms, how do I present my First Nation council from setting up this business so that whoever is currently on council gets to hand out the jobs, or the houses, or the money, or something like that? And whichever family controls those positions suddenly gets to hand out the goodies. That's a fundamental human problem. It's not a First Nation problem. It's a fundamental human problem. And it illustrates the sort of danger there is in this close government involvement in business. And when you have nations that are owning businesses, you would hope they would pay very careful attention to how we set up those businesses to protect ourselves from that kind of issue. But I think it can be done. And again, as with so many of these things, I tend to go to the cases that work. So, for example, the Winnebago tribe of Nebraska has a multi-million-dollar corporation that has reduced their unemployment dramatically, yields millions of dollars to the nation. It is not a gaming operation. This is not the success of gambling in Indian country. They run they not only retail gasoline, they wholesale it, they own hotels, they run the biggest website, Indian news website on the web, Indians.com, at least the biggest one in the United States. They do all kinds of things. It is very carefully set up and very consciously set up And in the charter of that corporation, which has a kind of a firewall between corporate decision-making and the legislature, they say in the charter of that corporation, we have set it up this way in order to prevent inappropriate political interference in the business affairs of the corporation. That firewall is important, but what they also do is make sure that that corporation is pursuing the nation's goals and that doesn't escape, in a sense, from the nation. And just to give you illustrations of what that might look like, we've had a couple of nations that have been very tempted to get into the gaming business, but the nation's decided gaming's not right for us. So we'll pay the economic price and not go down that road. Or we have a corporation that wants to get into a relationship with some outsider, but we're uneasy about that relationship. You can put in place things that protect the nation from this sort of inappropriate political interference, but still allow the nation to assert a strategic plan that says, here's what we value, here's what we want you as a corporation to deliver to the nation, here are the things which we think are forbidden to the corporation. We're not going into gaming, or we're not going to sacrifice that west end of the res, in spite of the fact that it's full of oil and gas, because that actually is where we gather medicine, and decisions of that sort, and make clear to the corporation, we're giving you a set of operating principles, but then it's hands-off. You know where we want you to go. You now get us there, and we'll expect you to come back and show us that you're following that strategic plan. I think Doug is exactly right. This is very tough to do, and it's why the success stories are so important. And there aren't just one or two. We're seeing this beginning to happen across Indian country. But what it took was that consciousness at the front end that said, this is dangerous. We're going to own businesses. This could become the thing that destroys the nation, that divides our people, that puts family against family. This is dangerous stuff to work with, and let's be careful going into it and thoughtful about how we do it. That's, I think, what it takes. And then you do the best you can, and you learn as you go what works and what doesn't.
Thanks very much. I'd really like to thank Doug for asking that question, which I think is so fundamental. I think as you go around and talk to people in different communities around the province, that's the first thing that people associate with the Harvard Project, is this notion of separation of politics from business. And in some communities, it's really helped make things clearer, but in many cases, either because the nation wasn't clear or because consultants who have been working with the nation aren't clear, it has the form of separation but doesn't accomplish any of the purposes that have driven that research question. And so the results have been pretty mixed across the board. And if we're going to keep that as a slogan, we at least need to get a lot better at seeing what it should mean. So thank you both for the question and the answer. I think that really got at an important point for us tonight. Now I'd like to call on Laurie Simcox. Laurie works on economic development issues with Waututh First Nation, and in particular with Tsleil Developments, which is a real estate development company in North Vancouver. And she also teaches about Aboriginal tourism at the Canadian Tourism College in Vancouver. I'd like to point out that she graduated with her BBA from Simon Fraser University, even though she went somewhere else to get her MBA. That was before we had our EMBA in Aboriginal Business and Leadership, where Laurie would have been proud to be part of our program.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me on this panel today, and thank you, Ian, as well. I'm from the Trundetquitchin First Nation in Dawson City, Yukon, is where my mom is from, and I grew up in Whitehorse, Yukon. And I did come to, left the Yukon when I was 18 to go to SFU, which was an amazing experience up on the mountain there. And then took some time off, and I 4 years, I started working with the Waututh First Nation in economic development in different contract work in different areas of I guess, government projects. research and report writing and so forth. Then after a while I did my MBA at Royal Roads University. I know the pain you guys are feeling now. It will be over. Best and worst time of my life. It's a lot of work, but definitely a great experience doing your MBA. There's so much that you learn and that you take away from that. I also did my management consulting designation with the Canadian Association of Management Consultants shortly after that. And I guess been working in different capacities with the Tsleil Nation as an internal management consultant. The lecture today has been so interesting to me because it relates directly to a lot that I do specifically with the nation. And I want to talk more specifically about business and governments because that's kind of the area that I've been working in. You know, for me, working directly in business with the nation, I always joke that we're kind of like the dragon's den. Being a First Nation so close to downtown Vancouver, you know, that first challenge of isolation doesn't so much exist for the nation. It is small in size, but you know, has access to such a great economy being downtown Vancouver. We have so many people now. We've come so far in the last 15 years. 20 years with the development of Tsleil developments. They have 800 units, condo units on reserve. From then into several different businesses, including a tourism business, a driving range, a fisheries company, a forestry, and now we're in construction and partnership building. So to me, it's very interesting in looking in how you discuss the challenges that exist, because there is sides in isolation, but I think specifically for the nation, the one challenge that we've had the most issues with has been the government challenge, with government becoming involved and trying to help, but not really helping. One area in particular that I work in is, and just recently in the last 2 years, and it's kind of new to First Nations country, but developing partnerships in the construction industry and going after federal and provincially initiated procurement opportunities. So the federal and provincial governments, as well as a lot of private sector companies, want to work with First Nations. They have Aboriginal procurement policy, they always have. But there necessarily hasn't been a way to engage in those in a way that's been successful for First Nations. What I've done over the past 2 years in creating relationships, specifically in the construction industry, is I've gone out and in many different areas, from crane development to Fraser River Pell and Dredge to Barry Hamill, crane engineering, over 15 different partnerships, and creating MOUs around that. Then going after contract bid opportunities with large companies such as CSTEM, the Evergreen Line project, Port Metro, BC Hydro. They all have procurement strategies. The challenge comes is that some of these policies are meant to help, but in a sense they prohibit business. If you look at a lot of these procurement policies that exist currently, they require 51% ownership with a First Nation, and they also require majority First Nation workers within this company. Well, the Tsleil Nation has a 3% unemployment rate. So the chances of having majority First Nation workers within that company is not going to be feasible in most cases. 51% ownership works great for a lot of First Nations, and a lot of companies have been very successful. But that's also a very expensive, slow-moving vehicle that makes it very hard to bid competitively, especially in the construction industry. So how do you get around that? Here the government is trying to create opportunity, yet it's creating challenges. So I just had this conversation with a group, and particularly a procurement manager from Port Metro Vancouver, who all were very excited to announce their new procurement strategy, which included a 51% ownership and a majority First Nation worker company. And I said, well, that's not necessarily going to work with the structures that we've created. How do we get around that? How do we make this work? And to them, I guess there's stereotypes around First Nation business, right? About what works and what doesn't work. And to them, their concern was that the First Nation was going to be taken advantage of. And I said, well, how can it be taken advantage of when I created those terms, right? I negotiated them. I created them. We're the First Nation. So in a sense, you're not trusting that the First Nation itself can manage its own affairs, which still exists. It's unbelievable that, you know, so many organizations meant to help actually hurt, right? You know, it went so far as they needed to talk to the CEO of C-SPAN for them to be able to believe that we negotiated proper benefits for ourselves, and you know, very, very disappointing way of seeing things where really these partnerships can be quite mutually beneficial if you think about it, where there's you know, opportunities back to the First Nation, where companies like Port Metro could have huge success, but really they limited themselves through their own procurement policy because they're going to be limited to those companies able to engage in those. So I guess learning, you know, and working through this process of realizing what you hit on is that rules don't always work. The one company that we've had the most success with, C-SPAN, has no rules. Basically, we do a lot of work on a handshake, and that's what a lot of our partnerships are. But that has created. We were in a Business in Vancouver article not too long ago, also on Global, and where Jonathan Whitworth is the CEO of C-SPAN, said he's proud to say that Tsleil partners have to date received 35% of the contract bid opportunities on the shipyard modernization project, and that was incredible. And that was basically with a company that's created no rules. Their procurement policy is probably less than 2 sentences, but it works because you build relationships, right? You build relationships, and you so it's easier actually to do business with those areas that don't have those rules. So I guess when it came down to the end of the conversation with Port Metro, the procurement manager believed in what I was you know, doing with the partners, and she sent me an email and she said, actually, you're not going to fit under our Aboriginal procurement strategy, but you will fit under our sustainability policy, which states that any business that provides return to a community, so you're not Aboriginal, you're sustainable. So I guess my question centers around that, and I guess it's not necessarily a question, but more of a food for thought. Is that an area that First Nations should start to consider? I mean, I guess not be bound by those definitions of what Aboriginal is. You know, somebody say, well, that's ridiculous. Let's just go after that Aboriginal procurement policy. Well, you know what? It's not going to work the way it is. It's going to take a long time for it to change. So let's just be sustainable. I guess that's my food for thought.
I like that food for thought, and thank you for that. I think, you know, there's a long history in Indigenous relations in your country and mine of very well-intentioned damaging rules. And, but also I think a lot of times those rules are driven by worst cases. So there are nations out there that probably benefit from that set of rules because they're in a particularly difficult situation, and a company that's dealing with them being compelled to observe some of those rules, it may be to their advantage. I don't know. But just as we tend to look for single solutions, we tend to think Indians are all alike, or First Nations are all alike, or boy, if you visited one nation, now you understand. I mean, not that I have any privileged access, but I mean, every time I'm out there in an Indigenous country, I'm learning something new, because I'm often in a place I've never been before, and guess what? It ain't the same. And I think in some ways that's one of the things government also has to learn. And that, if you learn that and understand it, then you tend not to create blanket rules. You tend to create incentives for people to work out rules that work in a particular situation, rather than putting everybody under a similar set of restrictions. And I think that's, you know, one of the lessons. It's tougher on government. It is. I run a research center. When I get a rule I can enforce without thinking about it, it's a relief. Don't have to think about this issue, just apply the rule. So I have sympathy for people who look for rules that make life simple. But Indigenous relations are not simple, and Indigenous development is not simple. And we've got to begin to think in terms of diversity of rules as well as solutions. Thanks for that, Lauren.
Great, thanks very much. So we're moving into our next mode now. Now, there were these cards sitting around, and if any of you have questions and you'd like to write them down on the cards, then Dr. Michelle Corfield, who is Executive in Residence at the Beedie School of Business and Chief Legislator of the Waututh First Nation, among other things, would be happy to collect them. Just before we start with these ones, I'd like to ask if there are any questions from students in the EMBA program. Yes, Conrad.
Yeah, just with, hi.
Sorry.
With respect to your presentation, I mean, I understand there's 25,000 Aboriginal people in Vancouver, I believe. Wouldn't does it say just your reserve, or why can't the people from the urban people go work very close to your company?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I guess it's, and that's what we've been doing. The Tsleil Nation works quite closely with the urban Aboriginal population, and where possible, we bring in First Nations people to do training. All of our partners offer training and work on particular projects. The thing is, with some of these good opportunities that I'm talking about, they come in tomorrow and they go for 3 months, right? So it's not always sustainable employment. When you have to be ready tomorrow with a majority Aboriginal work, it doesn't always work, right? And our partners who have been in business for 30 years to try to, we're building towards that capacity, all of us as First Nations community, but it shouldn't prohibit what we're capable to do now, right?
And another quick question from anyone in the EMBA program? Yes, David.
So I'm just listening to, I found it very interesting to hear the talk around diverse solutions. So I'm thinking of in terms of, we always have treaty, non-treaty. There's always these extremes on both sides. So, and then when we're looking at business structures and governance, and we're trying to figure out what works in particular situations, and it seems like there's always one extreme to the other. And we're just, one of the things that resonating with me over the last few days in class is about innovation. So we're constantly trying to think outside the box and look at alternative solutions. So I guess the question is more around what do you see as an alternative or sort of the in-between solution to the separation of business and politics? So if you have leadership in positions that are actually capable of holding those roles, what's the sort of dynamic that you could look for or put in place that would enable that?
I'm really glad you asked that question. I think sometimes this issue gets, exactly what you said, it gets drawn into this, you've either got it or you don't. And I remember Clarence Louis saying to me once, you know, it's great to think about separating business from politics, but we're a small nation and we're all related to each other. And unless you make all your business people outsiders, they ain't gonna be separated, not the way we're talking about. And that changed the way that I think about that. This was some years back. Because I think of it as managing that relationship. And what you have to do is be aware of the potential difficulty of that business-politics relationship and figure out ways to manage that so that it doesn't undermine business performance or alternatively distract you from the nation's strategic goals, which are the two sort of dangers there. And some nations have done that in certain ways. Some have done it with very specific criteria for council-board relationships, relationships between the nation's elected council and a board of directors that make clear what areas the council can speak to and what areas are beyond its purview. That's one way you manage that, even though you may have people who are related to each other in these two situations, which is potentially difficult. One of the most successful in nation-owned corporations we've seen in the United States is an orientation of all newly elected councilors to business operations, and it includes an orientation to why it is important not to have business decisions turn into political decisions or turn into family decisions. In other words, they rely on education to manage this interface. So it's not as if the solution for everybody is going to say, okay, we're going to draw this firewall between the two, because in a nation of 500 people, that may be very difficult to do if you're planning to take advantage of the expertise that people in your community may have. So then you've got to find some way of managing that connection. So I tend to, and Mark's right, we've become very known for this phrase, separating business from politics. I tend to now, I used to use that phrase a lot. Now I tend to avoid it and talk about managing that space, which is full of potential problems. And then talk about how different nations have gone about doing that successfully, so that people begin to realize there are multiple ways to do that. They better work.
Okay, we have sort of 3 questions here that have been written, which I'm going to take next. Two of them are quite closely related. The first is, what is the role of entrepreneurship in Aboriginal economic development? The second one is, how do you manage community, government, economic development versus member business opportunities when they compete?
Great.
So you can answer both of those.
Great questions. What we're seeing, at least across a lot of the nations that I work with, is increasing emphasis on what we call citizen entrepreneurship. That is, business startups by citizens. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that some nations have kind of exhausted the nation-owned enterprise opportunities. They're sort of doing what's obvious in the nation-owned enterprise area, and they're starting to look for other ways of generating jobs and revenue and addressing various problems. The other thing is people want to get into business. And a lot of the reserves and reservations that I see, one of the striking things that's missing is a retail sector. And most of that is small business. And most of it is absent, which means those dollars come onto the res, and the next thing you know, they disappear into the pocket of somebody off the res. And of course, it's often a very limited market, so it's not as if anybody starting a business is going to make a big success of it. But we're seeing a growing number of nations that are saying, we need to generate that kind of activity here on the res if we can. And one way we'll do that is by offering programs that encourage our citizens to get into entrepreneurial activity. So the Citizen Potawatomi Nation in Oklahoma, for example, has a major small business development component in its Community Development Corporation. They're a very successful nation. They've taken some of the profits from their businesses. They have a loan program for tribal citizens who want to start businesses of their own. Getting a hold of that loan is tough. You've got to pass their financial literacy course. You've got to take your business idea to their technical experts who are tribal people and get them to take a look at it. And if they think it's not quite up to speed, then you're going to have to go back and do some more work on it, and they'll help you with that because their goal is, we want to get you to the point where you can get a loan from this nation and start a business. And by the way, that program, and this speaks to the other question, is available to any enrolled Citizen Potawatomi Nation citizen anywhere in the United States. And this is a nation of about 27,000 citizens with significant populations in LA, Phoenix, Denver, Wichita, Kansas. And there are people, citizens of that nation in those cities, starting small businesses in those cities with loans from the Citizen Potawatomi Nation and taking their financial literacy course either online or by phone or however it might be, because they want all their citizens, whether they're resident on their land or not, to have those kinds of opportunities. And they consider that an integral part of economic development. It involves citizens in the economic development effort. It's no longer just the nation's responsibility, it's everybody's responsibility. It lets people take care of their kids, it lets them build careers. It does all those kinds of things, and they do it through the nation's vision and services. So I think this is a growth area. I think it's incredibly important. It raises governance issues. If you want to start small business on a res, you know, what was the first question that a lot of American corporations asked when the Soviet Union's lid was taken off Eastern Europe? What's the status of the rule of law here? Am I going to take $40 million and invest them in what used to be East Germany and then discover that it's all old-style stuff and run by cronies and, you know? Because if so, I got options. I'll take my $40 million and go somewhere else. Well, if you've got citizens who have business ideas, you want them to start their business on the Navajo Nation, which has very high unemployment, or take their ideas to Flagstaff or Phoenix or LA. If you're the nation's leaders, your attitude, I would think, would be, no, we want them starting that business right here. What does that mean I have to put in place in the way of governance institutions to protect that person's investment and persuade them that we're a better bet than Flagstaff or Phoenix or LA? Invest at home, invest with your nation. You'll be treated fairly, your investment will be secure, and we'll honor you for making that kind of commitment. That's an entrepreneurship strategy. And I think it's a coming thing in a lot of nations that we talk to.
Anyone else like to comment on that particular question? Going once, going twice? Okay.
Yeah, Mark, if I could add to that,
Yes.
so I just wanted to ask you, maybe you could shed some light on that. So, under that umbrella of the Potawatomi Nation reaching out to their members, so in reversing that thought to earlier, one of your statements was the fourth challenge was kind of like learning to govern ourselves better, and that kind of the offshoot to that, if you didn't, meant that a brain drain was happening of all the things. So under that light, then, what are some, maybe you could shed some ideas on reversing that trend, other than just reaching out to people in the urban centers? How do you, what are some thoughts about bringing them back?
Well, there are a number of nations where I think as we've seen economic success take root in the nations, we've seen a reverse in the out-migration, and Mississippi Choctaw is a very good example of that. In the 1970s, they were one of the poorest tribes in the United States. They had massive high school dropout rates. People were leaving right and left. 40 years later, they've got citizens moving back onto their land, bringing them skills, bringing them experience, because they've created an economy that works, and they've basically invited their citizens to say, come home, and people are doing it. So you can do that. I think the other thing that's kind of interesting about Potawatomi, and this is two-way without necessarily meaning a physical move back to the res, Citizen Potawatomi, with these large off-res populations, has recently redone its tribal constitution. It's I may get the figures wrong on this. I think it's a 16-seat legislature. 8 of those seats have to be filled by people who are residents of Potawatomi County, Oklahoma. That's their homeland, so to speak. And the other 8 seats can be filled by any Potawatomi citizen anywhere in the United States. And they run their council meetings, their legislature, with video screens on the wall. So the gal who is elected to the tribal council, the legislature, I realize tribal council is a different term here, but elected to the nation's legislature and lives in LA, her face is on the wall and she's real-time participating in the debate and voting on the issues. And they've given those people out there a stake, not just economically, I can access Citizen Potawatomi Nation services like small business loans, but I actually have a voice in what happens to that nation. Their sense of their nation is the United States. They've divided it up into 8 districts, and those representatives represent those districts. It's a continent-wide conception of who we are as a nation. The homeland is in Oklahoma. If you're part of us, you're part of us. It's a really interesting conception. They're further down that road than any other nation I know. It's a pretty interesting place.
It should be noted half of our cohort doesn't live on our home nation at all.
Right. Good point.
Here's a question kind of on the other side of things. With respect to working with Aboriginal business, how do organizations like BC Hydro, you know what BC Hydro is?
Sort of.
Okay, so it's the Crown Corporation that provides electricity to everybody, regulates us all with regard to electricity. Balance the requirement for formal, complex contracts with the informality of a handshake based on trust, which I take it goes to your point, Laurie, so you may want to say something too.
Come on, Laurie, come up with something.
I've been actually meeting with project managers at BC Hydro for some time. BC Hydro has actually one of the most advanced procurement policies. It's that really that in between too many rules and no rules. Obviously, a Crown Corporation has to have rules because of the nature of its business. However, something that's very unique about BC Hydro is that it has an Aboriginal weighting, which a lot of other policies do not have. There's a 5% Aboriginal weighting to any contract bid opportunity that goes out by BC Hydro that says if you have a First Nations partner or you're a First Nations company, then that will mean a 5% boost to your bid, which greatly helps not only convincing your partners to work with you and provide that piece of the pie, but also helps them, provides that foot in the door for them that they wouldn't otherwise have. So that they've been able to work it in that sense, which has been quite terrific. It's just now is that current policy existed for so long, but now it's about trying to communicate that through the organization to the actual project managers that do the hiring, and realizing that there are First Nations available out there that are able to bid and be a part of that process.
The only thing I'd just add to that is, and I think Lori touched on it earlier, where she talked about building relationships of trust. You know, a lot of these corporations are going to demand those kinds of contracts, and it doesn't matter who they're dealing with, that's what they're going to be expecting. But underneath the formal contract, there's an awful lot that goes on in building relationships, and I think First Nations can build those relationships very much to their advantage and accomplish things that may not be part of the complex contract, but may be actually what the nation is after. But it takes an investment of time and energy to build those kinds of relationships.
Mark, could I just make a comment that part of the positive success of BC Hydro is also ensuring that they have on their board people who are aware and sensitive and push this, and Chief Pierre is a member of BC Hydro board and has been active in promoting that kind of work at BC Hydro. So that makes a difference too.
I have a number of other really interesting questions here, including ones from June and Dirk, which should be asked. But I think people are running out of steam a bit, and some people are anxious about getting home. There's one question which is from Joyce Murray that should be asked, but not at this time of night, which is asking Stephen Cornell what he thinks about the Indian Act. I think we'll spare him. I can answer that question, although he may discuss it further with Joyce in the lobby afterwards. I'm sure it would attract an interested audience. But I would like to thank each of our participants here and give them a small memento. So Doug?
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you. I really appreciate the fact that all of you came out and that we had this opportunity to talk together. If you're interested in chatting a bit more in the lobby outside, that would be welcome. And I look forward to seeing you again on future occasions. Thank you all so much for helping us with this, and thank you, Ian, for welcoming us.